So we are here with Ryan Scheiding. He is the writer and director of Nagasaki Kitty. The name may imply something kind of lighthearted and fun. The game itself, though, is something very serious. It revolves around the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, and we wanted to bring Ryan on to kind of talk about how you get from a position of developing a game about Nagasaki to kind of incorporating like a cat and figuring out the history behind everything. So Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's definitely a pleasure, and I'm kind of really looking forward to it. I played through the full version of Nagasaki yesterday. It's far more upsetting than the name would lead anybody on to. So the first thing I want to kind of go over is, you chose Nagasaki as the background, and I'm wondering why you chose that over Hiroshima, if there was a specific reason.
So that's a very good question to start out with. When I started doing atomic bomb research, there is a tendency to focus mostly on Hiroshima, and so that was one reason, was that I wanted to shift away from that. So within American historiography, there is a tendency to talk about from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima and use those as bookends for the war. And when you stop at Hiroshima, of course, you ignore Nagasaki and other things that are occurring at the end of the war. So that was one big part of it, was that I wanted to focus on on Nagasaki specifically, because there's a lot written about how Hiroshima has been the focus. And then the other side of it, the literature that inspired the story itself, the Hibakusha literature. And Hibakusha is a Japanese word that can be roughly translated to bomb-affected persons. So it's someone who either survived the bombing, someone who is a child of an atomic bomb survivor, either if the person was pregnant at that time or if they were born even years later, because they would potentially have birth defects as well. But one of the authors that really inspired me into making this game, her name is Heihachi Kyoko, and she was a Hibakusha from Nagasaki. So there was the side of, I wanted to make sure that we were focusing on the instead of having this Hiroshima focus, I wanted to make sure that Nagasaki was something that was acknowledged, and it fit well in my inspirations.
Okay, and that's kind of an important part to note, is that this game it's not really about the bombing itself. It is about these people and what they went through. And for it's not a long game, but there is a lot of depth to it. And I think for what you're trying to kind of touch on, I think you do a very good job with the assets you're given with RPG Maker. And that kind of brings me to my second point. Video games give you a lot of opportunity for depth and breadth, and you can do like massive 3D games and big action titles. So what was the inspiration that kind of had you take this from the concept of a 3D game down to a 2D RPG Maker, the incarnation it is today?
So the game actually started out that the idea of it spawned with a graduate course that I was taking during the early stages of my PhD. It was a historical monuments course, and at the end of the course, we had to, as our final project, we had to propose a historical monument if we were to design one ourselves. And my research is very much focused on the atomic bombings, and so obviously when I was working through like how would I want to do a monument to the survivors or the victims of the atomic bombs within North America, that's not the sort of thing that you build a statue to or something like that. So I started to focus on a digital game as my idea. And then when the course was done and I'd done this presentation on this is what I would want to make if I was going to make it, I just thought to myself, like, I have the tools. Why don't I actually do this? So I put together a team, and we made the original ideas that eventually we would work our way up to a 3D version in Unity. But what ended up happening was that there was a group of 4 of us, and later a 5th, that created a version in Twine, which you can still find today online at nagasakikitty.ca. But this particular version, we had always planned the project to be iterative. So I had done a bunch of design documents. I was ready to start on a 3D version, and it just never came together. We couldn't get funding. We couldn't get the schedules to work. And then one day in a group chat, one of my supervisor, Mia Consalvo, said, "Oh, RPG Maker's on sale if anybody wants to try this." So I bought it. It sat on my computer for a long time, and then eventually I sat down and was like, "Well, I want to learn this thing." And it was one of those situations. I sat down and it's like, "Okay, what do I do now?" I'm just sitting in front of this system. So I dug out the old documents, the design documents, and just started adapting them. And after originally it was just going to be so I could learn the system and then make something else, but I started to put things together and really liked what was there and thought that it had a lot of potential. And that's when I really locked in on RPG Maker and decided, you know what, this is going to become a full game. This is not just going to be something that I use to learn the system. I did have some funding that I was going to go and teach a workshop about historical game making at a university in Japan. And I bought the plane tickets and had everything to go, and the funding came in, and then COVID happened. So the trip got canceled. And then I suppose just like everybody else, I found myself with a lot of, maybe not necessarily free time, but a lot of extra time during COVID. And that's when I really sat down and built out the entire game. So it really, it was an idea that I was passionate about, and then it was just access to tools, access to time, playing around in the system and finding out, oh, this is something like, I think I can make something substantial here. And that's how, the more that I worked with RPG Maker, the more that I thought it fit, and the more that I thought, oh, there's ways that I can make arguments and make interesting gameplay with this. So it came about, I don't want to say naturally, but it developed very slowly, and then eventually hit a tipping point where it was like, I'm going to sit down and really work this all out.
And I think maybe for the best that it did work out that way. I think what you crafted was a game that lets the human side of it kind of show. When you get into these big 3D games, you kind of get lost in the world that's built. And you were able to surprisingly build a decently descriptive world based on the assets of what you can get with RPG Maker, which we're going to get into later, because I don't know how you got some of that stuff, because I know RPG Maker is mostly fantastical in nature. But if you could go back, and if you could make that 3D experience, do you think you would? Or do you think that as it stands now, this is telling the story that you wanted to tell, and there's really, adding 3D elements to it wouldn't really add anything to it?
So when we originally, when I sat down and started working on this, when it became a solo project and it became just me working in there, a big part of it was, what did I think I was capable of doing? So there's a part of me that wants to say, of course, I want to make it 3D, and I want to keep building my my skills and keep trying new systems and working with all this new stuff. But then taking a step back and actually looking at what I have here, I'm very happy with it. I don't think I would want to make it into I don't think that this is a project that I want to be 3D, that I want to be hyper realistic, or realistic, so to speak, that I want to have like high graphical fidelity. I really enjoyed what I was able to do within the game itself and within the system. So particularly, one of the things that I did not want to find myself doing was focusing on hyperviolence and focusing on I don't want to call it the grotesque, but on deformity and radiation sicknesses and all of these things that come with the war and the atomic bombs. Now, I don't think that doesn't have its place. The Hibakusha literature that I mentioned before, one of the defining features of those many of those stories is that they are very graphic, and they go into exactly what radiation sickness looked like, what victims looked like the day of and in the days following. But myself, I wanted players to focus more on the people, and by not having this hyper realism in and graphic gore or anything like that. I think that it allowed the story to come across a little bit more like a little bit more that way. It was able to not dwell on it. I didn't want this to just, it doesn't just rely on shock value. It relies on actually playing through the game and trying to understand and see these as human and animal stories, rather than as just like a gawky like sideshow of, oh, look how horrible that looked, and not really making the connection.
Okay, yeah, I think you kind of touch on a good point where when you get into that hyper-violence, they almost become like a set piece. And it's something that people are, like you said, kind of just want to gawk at. There's a game, I think it was Sniper Warrior, did this a while back with like a white phosphorus bombing. And it was supposed to be like this really dramatic scenario, but it came off kind of gimmicky, almost, as if to try to paint this disaster as something that's supposed to be a disaster, but also, look how disgusting and gross this is. And, you're supposed to be shocked by it, but you're also kind of desensitized to it by the time you get to that point. So I think when you are dealing with something like the atomic bombings, you have to separate that so that you can tell these stories, because you're going to get so sidetracked by the kind of the gross and the terrible side effects of what kind of happened to those people, that you're not going to really look at that human element. And Nagasaki Kitty touches on that human element throughout the whole thing. And it's impressive that you can do that without having to say kind of outright, like, these are the terrible side effects of an atomic bomb. This is what we actually did over there. And you don't really lose that kind of dramatic approach, if that makes any sense. But I appreciated the route you took, and I think you were correct. And I would almost feel bad seeing it in a 3D spotlight, 3D setting. I think the way it is now in a 2D, everything is just kind of as it is perfect. So, and speaking of kind of the characters in the game, you mentioned animals, and of course the title is Nagasaki Kitty. I have to ask, and I know cats, I think you touched on this actually later in the game, but cats essentially like abandoned the cities as the Americans were bombing it. So when the atomic bombs happened, they weren't really present, if I remember correctly. And then as, in the aftermath, they started to kind of show back up and were sort of a pest control. But is there like a specific reason you focused on having a cat as like a side character?
Yeah, so as part of my PhD research, which I completed just recently in June, so I am Dr. Ryan Scheiding now.
Congratulations!
Yes, it's very exciting. But as part of that research, I look at the historiography of how the bombs have been represented in both Japan and in the United States. And so there's a lot of bits and pieces of research putting together that, and sometimes I just found things that I'd never really considered before. And so one thing early on in my research is there's this very long document called the Compilation of Materials on the Damaged Cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, something like that. It's this very, very long, committee name. And part of that book is literally just describing the things that happen in the city. And of course, there's a lot in there about people and radiation sicknesses and how buildings were destroyed and where they were destroyed, and things about the hypocenter and all these things that we would, I'd say, typically think of when we think of the atomic bombs. But one of the things that struck me at the time is that there's whole chapters in that book about how wildlife were affected, and how trees and plants were affected, and how even down to like insects. And this was a thing that I'd never really thought about before then, is that when we're talking about an atomic bombing, we're not just talking about a human disaster, but we're also talking about an animal disaster, about an ecological disaster, about this environmental disaster, however you want to define it. So I really started to think about the atomic bombs in those terms as well. And one of the first animals that I read about was actually rabbits. There was a pretty extensive scientific research done into rabbits in the immediate aftermath, because some of them, I believe they had been in a university research center or something like that. They were doing something with rabbits, so there were these rabbits that were affected. And at the time, she's since passed. I had my cat Tubba, and she was my best friend. And I just started to think about I started to think about the atomic bombs just beyond the human consequences, but also for, as I was saying, animals in the environment. And that's when I decided that I wanted to have this this animal character in the game as well. So I picked a cat because of my cat, and I really did think that that helped to ground the characters, the human characters, a little bit more, to humanize them a little bit more. This game is designed so that North American audiences can consider the victims of the bomb. This is not written for Japanese audiences. This is not me saying like this is exactly what it's like. This is a historical interpretation to bring across what the bombs were like for to North Americans so they can learn about it. And I just found that after I started like writing and working on having like an animal character in there as well, that really helped to humanize and ground Ayako as a character. So as I did say, and then my cat was the influence as to why I made it a cat. Funnily enough, I could not find very much at all about cats in Nagasaki or Hiroshima until I started working, until I was deep into working on the game. And then that's when I found the information that you were discussing in the game. That there were not, I don't want to say any, it's kind of hard, that there were not many cats, if there were any left at all, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those cities were not bombed as extensively as every other city in Japan. They had been left aside along with Kyoto and Kokura, and I believe one other city as well. They had been reserved for atomic bomb hits very specifically, so they would be intact, and that the Americans could do their research as to what the true effects of the bomb were. Despite that, there was still a little bit of conventional bombing that happened, and that resulted in many of the cats having left. And then, yes, after the bombing, the cats did come back in because there was a proliferation of pests, including mice and rats, and they could hunt. And there is, I found it oddly charming to think of these families like trying to rebuild their homes and rebuild their lives, and having like 7 cats that just kind of congregated around them and lived with them. So this that was just something that I found in the research that I was doing afterwards.
Okay, it was a good narrative choice. It does humanize. It also gives you a lot of sympathy for the protagonist, and it also helps. It gives her something to play off of too. Which makes it a little bit more engaging. You used an interesting word that I want to get back to in a little bit: consequences, and I think that's going to kind of play into a point I want to make about Nagasaki Kitty, the atomic bombings, and kind of the Western view of what we did over there. Before I get to that, I just want to say, hey, Jamie, thank you for joining us. Jamie is part of Epoch Xperience, and he is just kind of popping in.
Hello, Jamie.
So again, consequences. Nagasaki Kitty, like you say, is not meant to be. It's not fun. It's a very depressing game. It's very important, though. I want to stress how important something like this is, and I think as a historical gamer and somebody on your side that's developing historical games, I think these are the stories that need to be told, and they're the stories that aren't being told. So again, consequences. What we did over there wasn't something that we should be proud of, but I think in some way, as a country as a whole, we almost hold some sort of pride to the fact that we did this because it ended the war. But then we have a game like Nagasaki Kitty, which spins it that this is actually, it had terrible consequences for people that had nothing to do with the war. The main character, the cat, her mother. So I have to assume when you were developing this game that you had that kind of in mind, where you don't want to romanticize the atomic bombs as the war-ending efforts, but more so that it kind of ruined the lives of people that they were just going about their everyday lives. So when you started approaching this, did you kind of want to flip the narrative, so to speak, about what we actually did during those two bombings?
So a very large part of my research. This game is not connected to anything for my PhD. This is a side project. My translation partner in the game calls it a passion project. This is not something that we're being compensated for or any of this. So just want to kind of lead off with that. But within my career and within my research, I mentioned before that something that I focus on quite frequently is historiography. I'm not sure exactly what the audience is for this interview, so just to very briefly describe historiography. History would be the events that happened, and historiography is the history of how history is written. So for history, you read a book about that can summarize things. Historiography is you read all of the books, you compare them all, and you see where the argumentation is coming from and start to develop themes that you can see. I think that might be the simplest way to summarize that in 30 seconds. And my work is a historiography of the atomic bombs. As I said, I look at this in a Japanese, from how they're written about in Japan, but also within North America. So what I have found in North America is very much what you're saying. Something I mentioned before, there is a tendency to view the Pacific War or the Pacific theater of World War II as starting with Pearl Harbor and ending with Hiroshima. Some writers have referred to that as bookends. Some have referred to it. And when you use those as bookends, you have this idea that Japan started the war and that it was righteously ended by the atomic bombs. And this is a very prevalent way of talking about the war in historiography. Then in talking about the bombs themselves, there tends to be a focus on the achievement that they were, the scientific achievement. There is an abstraction of the victims when we talk about only the scientific achievements. There's an abstraction of victims when we think about things like the imagery of the mushroom cloud. As thinking about the bomb, we think about it as an abstraction of what was, instead of what was happening on the ground to people, what is happening in the sky, and has different connotations to it. In my study of historiography, I found that World War II is still celebrated as a good war. It's still celebrated as a necessary war. Atomic bombs are argued to be necessary. There's a lot of maneuvering that is done to excuse their use. And my idea within this, with this game and with a lot of the work that I do, is to shift the focus. I'm not the only person who calls for this. I don't want to make it seem like within historiography everybody writes this way, but it is a very smaller, it is a minority of writers who are writing that to shift the focus. There's some historical examples of this. There was a controversy with the Enola Gay. So the Enola Gay was the bomber that was used to drop the first bomb, Fat Man, on Hiroshima. When they wanted to, the plane is still around, it is still intact. They were going to show it at the Smithsonian, and the curator wanted to have the exhibit shift into sections, and one of the sections would be what is going to happen on the ground, what happened on the ground in Japan, and due to protests, that was removed. So there is a push to hide a lot of this. It is simultaneously a position. It is a object of joy and pride within American historiography, but also one of shame. One that needs to be very strictly defended. Because it does have that potential to be shameful, to be controversial, to be problematic. So, taking all this in mind, I thought that it is a very important thing that we do not see very much in historiography, and we certainly don't see in media the depiction of Japanese victims. Now, one thing that I do need to make clear, because this is something that does come up. This is should not at all be seen as any sort of a defense of Japanese war crimes or Japanese war aims. I fully acknowledge that all of those things did occur and were awful. But the idea that we should just completely disregard Japanese civilian victims is very problematic as well. So I know that this was a very long and meandering answer. There's a lot of things that go into making something like this, and there are a lot of considerations that go into that as well. And I recognized within my research that this was something that people would not know about, and has been actively hidden or swept under the rug, if you'd like to say. So that was my starting point as to how I would like to tell this story.
I mean, I think that sort of issue requires somewhat of a long and winded answer, so I think that's perfect. I wonder, though, if you would say a school approached you and said, "Hey, we want to change how we talk about this, and we think your game is one of the best ways to do it. It gives people something to connect to. It shows a side of it that isn't usually talked about." Would that be something you'd ever be open to, like having having Nagasaki Kitty as like an educational tool, so to speak?
Yes, it has been used as an educational tool, the first version of the game at least. The first version, which was the Twine version, for those who aren't aware, Twine is almost like it's a digital storytelling program. You could think of it as like a choose your own adventure novel. And it's written within HTML. The first version of this game that we made did some academic conferences and was actually went into a museum exhibit in Waterloo, Ontario. The name of the museum there is The Museum, so I always have to stipulate that when I say The Museum in Kitchener, Ontario, I mean the museum that is called The Museum. I have also found out recently that obviously within my work, I do academic conferences about the other aspects of my work, and I found out recently that my game has actually been showed in some classes as well. I have used it as a workshop material as well, and with RPG Maker MV, one of our goals, myself and we're making a translation version, the translator, is to develop this as an educational tool. So we've done a little bit in the past, and we're actively trying to engage that now.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great to hear. I think Epic wants video games to kind of start to be an educational tool. In fact, one of our viewers, the tattooed historian, John, is a huge proponent on Twitch as well, trying to get people to start realizing that video games aren't just an entertainment tool if they are properly approached. I think Nagasaki is a rare example where the whole point of it is to tell a story that is important and real without the kind of fantastical elements. But gaming in a whole, there's always going to be fantasy to it. Call of Duty, Battlefields, even like the Total War series that tries to be as grounded as it can be, there's always fantasy to it. So I think video games need to start to be approached as an educational tool, and I think games like Nagasaki Kitty are, they're the best medium you can choose. They're accessible. Literally anybody can play this. My wife, who's not a huge gamer, she can play it. Young children can play it because it's not graphical. Yes, the nature of it is mature, but it's also important. I mean, we were learning about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, early middle school, I would say. Mm-hmm. So why couldn't this be integrated more so into that sort of curriculum? Sorry, I get passionate about that. So I do think that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that it's actually starting to be, or glad to hear that it was approached as an educational tool. So I want to kind of get into the development side of it. You used RPG Maker, which is accessible to everybody. It is a paid service. It's limited. So again, I'm very curious how you were able to kind of create Nagasaki using the assets that are there, because I know a lot of the assets are for, like, if you want to recreate like a Final Fantasy type setting.
So I guess to start about this whole accessibility, one of the things that we did during playtesting one of the things I did during playtesting, I'm sorry, I get used to the social media speak where I need to say we when it is literally only me. One of the things that I did during playtesting is that the game was playtested by gamers and non-gamers. So it was I playtested by game designers that I know, and it was playtested by one of the playtesters is a lawyer from Seattle who does not play games. So it was just another one is a playtester who's kind of, or is another academic who is games adjacent but wouldn't call herself a gamer. So then within RPG Maker, the first few versions of it did not have all the assets that are in there now. So there are some, for example, there's some blood that is in there. In the first few versions, it was broken wine bottles, just because I put that in there, and it was like, okay, this is a good placeholder. At the time, I didn't have the same goals for the game, so I was like, this is a decent placeholder for it. But then I did invest in a few DLC packs that were called Japan packs. So some of your more stereotypical, this is what Japan would look like. But one of the things in the game, in the character design, in the level design, was myself stripping out a lot of these elements. So trying to pick the things that did not look like fantasy, elements, to take out the entire battle system. The entire battle system has been stripped out of this because I did not need it. Renaming certain parameters with it. So instead of HP and MP, you have empathy and knowledge, based on how many people you talk to, and finding the post game crystals. The crystals were the one high fantasy thing that I kept, because in the post game I just wanted them to stand out very easily so players could find them. I wanted there to be a bit of a hide and seek exploration element, but I didn't want it to be this obtuse things where you really, it's supposed to be an educational tool. I want someone to find all of them, but also give them like a little bit of a challenge. So it is, so to, I guess, directly answer the question, there's a few DLC packs in there, and then a lot of it was just care in design and trying to strip out elements. One thing in there is a character designer. So within the character designer, there are, for Mama, for example, I believe she's actually wearing kind of like a mage's outfit when she's supposed to be a nurse. So I had to recolor and make it appear to be like a nurse's outfit, rather than this armor. But so a lot of it was, as I said, just choices and design and trying to make it look like it was happening in 1945 Japan rather than in a high fantasy setting. So I'm glad that you noticed that was one of the things that took a lot of work, was going through all of the assets in there and being like, does this look like a thing that would exist in 1945? And then a lot of it was I used a lot of historical photographs and visual aids in the design as well. So it's like, okay, this is what a broken building is going to look like. So this broken castle rampart actually does kind of look like a broken concrete building from 1945. So if I do this right, I can plug things in like that.
Okay, very clever. I think it worked out very well. It feels like a game that's rooted in some sense of realism, as much as it can be. I know I think you had to hide something to look like a bell. So it's, use what you can, I guess.
The bell was the one thing that I couldn't find a replacement for, and was it's an iconic part of the destruction of Nagasaki, is the bell coming off of Murakami Cathedral. So it's a pyramid behind some rubble, but the pyramid is yellow and small enough that it kind of looks like a bell. Yeah.
It definitely works. Jamie, I think that is the link, rpgmakerweb.com. I haven't used that in many years, but I think that's the one. And it's a great tool, as we can see if you play through, or when you play through Nagasaki Kitty, and I highly recommend you do. A lot of options, gives you a lot of customization. You were able to take something that is supposed to be like a battle game and turn it into, again, an educational tool. So all it takes is a little manipulation, and it can be done. would you approach like a different aspect of World War II, kind of using the same, yeah, definitely brain short. Would you use the same assets and the same, RPG maker to approach a different aspect of World War II? Would you go back and do Hiroshima, since it is kind of the widely known one that people like to talk about? Or are you kind of happy with focusing specifically on Nagasaki and letting that kind of be the one that tells the story?
So I was very drawn to the idea of writing about and making this game about Nagasaki specifically. Whether I would do something, I don't know that I would be able to do anything that would be unique enough with Hiroshima. Obviously, the map itself would change a lot. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are very different cities. Nagasaki was traditionally had a lot more contact with the West. So Nagasaki has a Dutch harbor. There was a Chinatown there, or there is a Chinatown there. The city is on the in the westernmost island of Japan. So it is it's unique even among Japanese cities. Which is why you have things. It was the center for Japanese Christianity for hundreds of years as well. Which is why you have things like Murakami Cathedral. Which is why you have your it's like a port city as well. It was a little bit less destroyed than Hiroshima because it is mountainous, very mountainous, and the mountains kind of surround the city where the port is. So Nagasaki is a very unique city, a very wonderful city if you ever get the chance to go. And I was really drawn to it. So if I was doing Hiroshima, I think I could build something very similarly with a different style map and different buildings, but I don't know if it would add too much to what I've already done. Okay. Now, when it comes to other aspects of World War II, I'm not so sure. I think it's possible. The thing with designing a game like this is that, or a game in general, is that you need a very specific vision. You need to sit down and really plan things out and do your design documents and have that kernel or grain of an idea and then let it develop. So I would say potentially, but it's not something that I've really sat down and thought about. So it is possible if I decided to make a game about another aspect of World War II, that maybe, yes, it would fit very well with RPG Maker, or maybe I would get further into the development and be like, no, I want to do this with a different system. I want to do this in a different way. If I wanted it to be very text heavy, I could go Twine. If I wanted to go with something more 3D, Unity engine is something that I want to work with. So it's hard to say, but potentially it could work.
Okay. So do you think game development is kind of a long-term thing for you, or just as the ideas come in, you'll turn to it?
I had never planned on becoming a game designer. I played video games my entire, I want to say my entire life, since I was like 5 years old. So for the majority of it. And I've been writing about and researching games for more than 10 years now. So when I started my PhD, I had a lot of experience studying and writing about games, but I took a game studies course my first semester in Montreal at Concordia University. And I mentioned her before. Mia Consalvo was the instructor of the class, and to finish that class, you had to create a game prototype. There was no paper. There was you created a game prototype, and I'm so happy that was the assignment, because I had never considered myself even to have the ability. I was like, there's no way I could do something like that. So I started with Twine, a very simple tool, and once I started making games, it was like, oh, this is a thing that I can do, and they've become a very important part of my scholarship. So I am at a point in my career now that my PhD is done, and I am on the job market, and I'm starting to need to make some decisions. But one thing that I have seen within academia, in the very least, is that there is more space to be doing these more artistic ventures such as game design. And if I want to stay in academia, which I do, this is another avenue to allow me to keep doing that. So as long as I can keep doing it, I plan on doing it. But it is going to be contingent on a bunch of other stuff that's happening within my career, within my life. Who knows where I'm going to be in a year? Who knows where I'm going to be in 6 months? Even like it's one of these things. I think it's especially true coming out of COVID as well. So I want to keep doing it, and I think that it will be a valuable part of my academic career moving forward. So I hope that I have the opportunity to keep doing it.
Do you think you would stray away from historical stories, or is that kind of, if you were to kind of pursue another game, do you think it would again be rooted in history?
I just really love history. I started out, I started my undergrad at 17 as a marketing major, and I lasted, I think, 1 semester in that. I was sitting in my like introductory economics course, and it was just, I was so bored, and then it just hit me one day. It's like, oh wow, this isn't just the rest of my, this is the rest of my life if I let it be. And so I transferred into to history because it was like the one subject that I had done, that had held my interest and I had done well at when I got to the university level. And the more historical research that I've done, like I really love history. And though I did start to move on, my PhD is in communication studies, and my my second master's is in communication and cultural studies. So I have moved away from like capital H history. But I still find ways to be doing historical research and to be, I like to write about the past. So I think that as I move forward in game design, this is, once again, I can never know, but if the opportunity is there and it is up to me, which so often it's not up to us what we're doing, but if it is up to me, then yes, I think that I'll still be making historical games and writing about the past.
Is there a period that you may want to approach? Like when you started doing history, was there like a favorite period of yours that you were really, really engrossed in?
So I've always been engrossed in World War II, in that, and as I started to learn history, that just became more and more what I was engrossed in. And then I might have only been like 19 years old at the time. I was taking a World War II course at the University of Guelph, and we had a book review assignment. So, just that typical read this book and then write a 2-page report on it. And there was 2 options. There was Vichy France and the Jews was one book. And the other was The Divine Wind, about the kamikaze pilots. And I wanted to read the book about Vichy France, and it wasn't available in the bookstore. And the thing was due, typical undergrad. I hadn't really done a lot of planning. It was due in a week. So it's like, okay, or 2 weeks or whatever it was. So it's like, I'll read the other one. And I really became engrossed in Japanese World War II history. And then as I've moved forward in my academic career and started to have some different thoughts about what history is and who writes it and what it is about, what it does, like what its actual function is within power structures and within our society, I've become more and more interested. I've always been engrossed in World War II. Now, because it's given me different ideas about the way that power is structured. I might stray a little bit into the Vietnam War, the idea of the ways that weapons of mass destruction are used and justified, and I'm going to use justified, is an interesting concept to me that I think will be pulled forward as I go forward in my work. And then in the complete opposite direction, something I don't even know that I would have the capability to do, so I would really need to think about it a little bit more. Within Japanese video games, there's just a lot about that Sengoku, the samurai era, and there's a lot of potential interesting content there. So I have some ideas, but to this point in my career, in studying Japan and studying World War II, a lot of documentation is available in English, and I am able to do my research. If I were to shift into something like that, I would actually need to become fluent in like Japanese and be able to read and do a lot of that. And Of all of the things that I'm good at, language, I am not good at learning other languages. So it is one of those unfortunate things. It's something I would need to work a lot more at, but very interested in World War II. And then that was those two directions where I could see myself potentially branching off to in the future.
Okay. And not to plug Epic XP, but if you're ever trying to build something like a samurai game, that's what we're here for. I'm sure we have somebody on staff that either knows Japanese or would love to learn it just for the sake of researching. But that's I hear a lot of people engrossed in Japanese culture, and with games like Ghost of Tsushima and Sekiro, I think it was last year. I think it gets more and more popular, and I don't think there's so much material there that I don't think there's ever such a thing as too many Japanese-inspired games. There we go. Jamie knows a guy who knows a guy. So if you decide to go that route, just keep us in mind. Absolutely. So you're kind of the perfect example of somebody that started in one area and then kind of built into this. You can now call yourself a video game developer with the potential for having multiple titles under your belt. For somebody that may be in your same position who wants to get into development or maybe doesn't know that they want to, but may have that kind of an inkling, do you have any sort of advice for them, where to start, what they should look at? Just kind of, and again, more so speaking of like a historical gaming. So if they want to develop a historical game, is there a launching point that everybody should start at? Or is it just kind of, whatever inspires and kind of go from there?
I guess this is a very good question too. I guess there's two ways to approach this. One will be tools, and then one will be I want to call it the you of it. So tools wise, there is so much stuff out there now that is very easily accessible. So the idea that like I can't do it or you can't do it is going away more and more. And for a first project, your first project is not going to be like your project. Like it's going to be your thing where you learn, you see what works, what doesn't. And there are so many tools that are very, very good for that. So it's really going to depend on what you want to do. There's one of the programs that is very popular and is starting to gets a lot of play, and a lot of students learn it, is Twine, as I've mentioned, because it can be a complex system, but it is a very, very simple system. It's one of those, a minute to learn, a lifetime to master, something like that. It's a very low entry bar. It's free. It is more text-based. So if you want to write a game, which is what I find a lot of people want to write a game, then this is a way to write a game. RPG Maker was just one of several tools that I could have used if you want to get into more of a, like, we'll call it like a traditional game. So that is an excellent tool. There's a GB Studio, which can be used to make almost like bootleg old style Game Boy games. Can be fun to play around with. There's Game Maker, there's Unity is free, and Unity is an even better example of a minute to learn, a lifetime to master, because you can make anything in Unity. It is a completely free system. And then there are so many options, I guess is what I should say. So it is more, you are capable of it. It's just deciding, as we shift over to the other side, what is it that you want to do? And then there is so many systems, many of them are free, so many programs, so many things that can fit what your goal is. And then the final part of it is just two words: just start. You just need to start.
Don't overthink.
You can plan and plan and plan, or you can worry and worry and worry, or you can tell yourself 1,000 times that you're not good enough to do a thing. Just start. When you start, you may find that this is not a thing that you want to do, but you also might find that you really enjoy it, and that you want to learn more about it, that you want to build your skills, that you want to do this sort of stuff. Until you start, you don't know. And it's those first steps into it. Honestly, one of the harder things that I've had to do is that I do, as I said, as part of my academic practice, I teach game making workshops now. And my thought for every single one is, I don't want to tell you anything. Just go into the system and play around. That's not good teaching, so I don't do that. But that's how I got into this, is just find the thing that, do a little bit of research, find the program that's going to let you do what you want to do on that most basic level, and then just get in there and start playing around with it. See what you want to do. Think about what you can do. One of the fun things for me about working with RPG Maker is that there were so many things where I would have an idea and be like, there must be a way to implement this, or I would be trying to put it into the system and going like, why is this not working? And then there's so many resources online that you can be about 15 seconds away from just a YouTube video that's going to tell you exactly what to do. And then you go, oh, that's a little bit obtuse, but I understand, like, this works that way, so that then this cascade of all the other things to make it all fit together. So find the system that lets you do what you want to do, and then just start. You can do it, just start.
Wonderful advice. And I think that's 100% accurate, especially these days. Just dive into it. Don't overthink it. Just go. Really, once you put too much thought into something, you could very easily talk yourself out of doing it.
Very much so. And I'll admit, like, a few of the things that I built, I have another course that I took was a player studies course. We very specifically had to build a game for a specific player. So it was my friend Robin. I built a game for her, and it is terrible. It doesn't work. The concept did not work. I had to write an outgoing report on it for that course, and it was the report was, it doesn't work, and this is why it doesn't work, but here is the idea as to why it might work. The first couple of times when you go out to build a thing, you might build a thing that does not work, that is terrible, that doesn't accomplish the thing you want to do, but you'll learn so much about the system in doing that, and you'll learn so much in game design and so much in just in general. You will gain a lot from it, and the first thing that you build is not going to be the best thing that you build. It's going to be that second, third, fourth project as you move forward and understand the systems more. I guess the best example is the best things that you wrote are not from the first grade. You wrote a little bit better after that. The first pictures you drew were not as good as the things you draw now. Well, first pictures I drew.
Yeah, that's definitely not true for me.
I don't have for an artist, for someone who draws, you get better as you do more with it. And game design Absolutely. Is very much like that as well. It is not the just start of it is also to sometimes get some of those bad ideas out. Get some of those ideas out where you think that you know more than everyone who's ever tried it before, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, well, that's why people don't do it that way. This is broken, that doesn't work. It's another part of it.
And you can always go back and redo it with something else. If you tried it in one program, 5 years down the line, you may find a different program that it works better on.
Yeah, there's the project is never dead. The very first thing that I made, I was like, okay, cool, that's done. Never gonna look at that again. And then I worked in Twine a little bit more, and that other game ended up being part of a gallery show. Someone approached me and was like, I'm doing this thing. I think your work might fit in there. Do you have anything? And I was like, yeah, I have a thing. And then I went back and go, ooh, this thing is not very good. So I had to polish it up and to get it to a level that I liked it more. But that is another thing as well. Keep the files, they're there, and you might have a eureka moment. You might have another opportunity to work through it. It's always there.
Yeah, I've learned no matter what you're doing, never delete. Never delete a thing. Have 1 million hard drives if you need, but never delete anything. I regret so much that I've deleted. So, I mean, I appreciate that you came on the chat with us again. I want to stress to everybody, Nagasaki Kitty is a game that I think everybody should play. I think even if you're not the least bit interested in history, I think we need to start getting into an idea that what we were taught in school and what we know is not what actually happened, or there's parts of it that need to be filled in. And I think a game like Nagasaki Kitty is perfect for that. It fills in this huge gap that is just glossed over. And it does so with, I want to say minimal resources, because RPG Maker is great, but it's not, it's not a technical advancement like a Call of Duty game. And I think actually in ways your game is more effective than, say, the first Call of Duty 2. And the many recreations of the Normandy invasion we've all played through. So I again stress that everybody should play it. It's like $2, right? You're not
Yeah.
even, yeah. And you can find it. I know there's links on your Twitter. There's links on your Facebook. Twitter is Nagasaki_Kitty, and your Facebook is Nagasaki Kitty, right? At Nagasaki Kitty. Okay. So it's easy to find, and I think everybody should go out there and check it out. Dr. Ryan Scheiding, is there anything else you want to kind of add on, or any questions for us, or?
There was one question that you had here in the some of the you sent me some questions beforehand, and there was one in here that I was just particularly interested in, and let me see if I can go down here. Do you think the average indie developer would find it a bit more difficult to pull relevant historical information about their topic? Which I thought this was a thing that I think about all the time, is that I do have all of this historical training, and something that I wanted to just mention briefly is that I think yes, it would definitely be very difficult for another developer to do a project like this, or to do a historical project in general. And it's not really an issue of access. It's more of an issue of, I guess, discernment. So the value of like the historical expertise that I have, or a company like yourself has, is in both finding relevant resources and knowing how to find the relevance within that resource.
Absolutely.
It's very easy to just jump onto Google and to jump onto Wikipedia, or even to just go to the local library. And this ties in a little bit about what I was saying about historiography and history. History is this idea that we can, of like piecing together the events, and historiography is reading all of these sources and combinations. So the expertise starts to help there, in seeing, like, I did not just read one book and make this game. I don't want to say hundreds, but over the course of the 10 years, and then within doing my PhD, there's a lot of background reading to understand not only which sources are good and accurate, but why they're good and accurate, and what they're arguing, and then when inference is being made, and what we can and can't know, and these sorts of things. So there are many people who think that they know history, but what they actually know is just this really specific curated version of the past. And I think that that's a thing to, as an indie developer, or as any sort of historical developer, to take into account. There's a lot of times where, as I said, we think that we know, but as soon as you start to probe that, and to think about that more deeply, and to really start to do the research, is where you start to find these more what happened. And if there's one other idea that I could just throw in here, it's this this idea that people want historical accuracy is not necessarily true. Typically what gamers want is authenticity. So they want a thing that they think is accurate, not the thing that is accurate. So nobody wants an accurate World War II game. The ways that battles went down in the Pacific Islands are some of the most grotesque and gruesome and horrific things that you could ever read about. And you absolutely would not want to do that in the first person. That's why Call of Duty plays like Doom, because players want to play Doom, and they want it skinned as World War II. They don't want a World War II experience. They want a first-person shooter experience. So as another thing to just keep in mind as a developer is that to be historically accurate is not necessarily going to make a great game. To be authentic, to create that authenticity is not going to create something historical. And trying to find that middle ground where you are still being true to history and incorporating that into your design and your gameplay and your story and your characters is a thing that audiences are very much interested in, and that work does come through, and it is things that people can see. And I think that that's where the value of having the historical background, the historical training, or access to people with the historical training and background can be very valuable.
Absolutely. I mean, you brought up a point that I normally bring up. My questions are off to my side, and I'm a mess today. But yeah, it's authenticity over accuracy, and there is that middle ground. In fact, recently, just to throw in a little anecdote, I played Medal of Honor Pacific Sun or Rising Sun, and they open on Pearl Harbor. Anybody that actually has looked into Pearl Harbor, and I used to do a little coverage for a tour group many years ago. It wasn't this big action set piece where the Americans were banding together and fighting and shooting down dozens of Japanese Zeros. And Medal of Honor framed it where you're on this battleship knocking down Zeros out of the sky left and right. And the reality is we took down like 7. And it was, it's not, you do have to understand that you're catering to an audience that wants entertainment value. So you can't be accurate because there's nothing entertaining about war, first off, but there's also nothing entertaining about how many of these battles played out. Pearl Harbor, from the American point of view, if you tried to create an accurate version of that, it would just be you running around and kind of, pulling people out of the water that are on fire, and it's upsetting and distressing and terrible, and it's not fun. So yeah, there is a middle ground, absolutely, and I agree with that point 100%. And I usually make that point, so I'm glad you made it. Again, there are a lot of resources out there, and there's 100 ways to interpret resources. There's 100 different resources to interpret. So it can be difficult, and you're right. You can't just look at Google and say, "Oh, well, this is what Wikipedia says, so it's true." Wikipedia may have verified sources at this point, but it's not on its own. It's not a research tool that you should use when trying to build something like this.
Certainly. And it's even just beyond that, you can have a Pulitzer Prize winning Ivy League historian who writes their book, and that is still an interpretation. And that's still now, you never want to just discount something because you disagree with it, but there is this there is the idea that you do need to go just a little bit further with that. So yeah, it's a thing that I think about quite frequently, and it's something that I write about within my or someone going by pretty quick there.
Yeah.
Within my academic work, within my academic writing. Is something that I cover a lot too.
That's great, and I think that's something we need to start discussing more, is that history isn't just one person's perspective. You can't just read an American textbook, and on the flip, you can't just read a Japanese textbook and feel like you know what happened in the Pacific throughout the entire theater. So that's a fantastic point, and it's one that we will make time and time again, because history is not as most people know it, and it's a little frightening when people think they know about even something as global as World War II. There's so many different interpretations of what happened, so many different ways that things played out, and it's just, you got to know that you can't just read one source and know that and think that you have the whole story. So again, this brings me back to the fact that Nagasaki Kitty is such a surprisingly important piece of that, because you take the Japanese story and you make sure it's out there, without really, you're not really saying what the Americans did wasn't necessary, even though we could have a whole discussion on that. But you're just making sure that the other side of that is being heard, so that when people do discuss, should we have done it? Did we have to do it? Anything like that, they can say, well, this is the actual effect of it, and they can start taking that into consideration. So again, it's a great little game, and I think it's important to what we try to do out here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that it's every time that the audience expands for it even a little bit, it's very exciting. And I'm very happy when to get some exposure like this, and to get this in front of more people is really our primary goal.
Of course, and I'm happy to be doing what I can to make sure other people get to know about it. And I really would love to chat with you more, kind of in the future, especially if you decide to take on another endeavor. So I really appreciate that you took the time to sit with us. And if, unless you have anything else you want to kind of add, I'll let you go about your day.
Thank you so much for having me. I suppose just very, very quickly, we have officially, it is we this time, announced that there is going to be an expansion to our game. We're translating the game into Japanese. It's being translated at an intermediate level. So the translator's name, a friend of mine, Dr. Mimi Okabe, is also a Japanese language instructor. So we're trying to expand the reach of the game a little bit further that way by having this game available as a language teaching tool as well. So that is a thing to keep an eye out for. Small marketing pitch. This is, as I've said, this is a passion project designed by one person with no compensation. So any support that we can get at all is absolutely great. Sharing on social media. If you want to make a purchase, that's great as well. Every little bit allows me and now Mimi the opportunity to keep working on a thing that we think is very important, and to be able to pay for the website and to be able to continue doing all of the work on social media, doing the marketing, doing stuff like this. This is the part that I am the most uncomfortable with. They don't teach us how to do this in academia because typically this is not the thing that we do. But I think that this project is very important. We always want to expand the audience. So as Mark mentioned, it's at Nagasaki_Kitty on Twitter and also on Instagram. If you want to watch some of our old trailers, we have them there. It's at Nagasaki Kitty on Facebook. And Mark, I don't have access to the Twitch chat, but if you could drop the link to the itch page where the game is actually for sale, we would really appreciate that as well. This has been a great opportunity to be interviewed. Thank you so much for inviting me. I loved talking about this. And once again, I can't see the audience, but to everybody that was in the audience, thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen to me talk today. Outside of the Nagasaki Kitty stuff, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Scheiding. My website's ryanscheiding.ca if you want to look into me a little bit more, or if you want to contact me. Those are two great places to start.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Dr. Ryan Scheiding. Again, congratulations on completing that PhD. And you and I will definitely be in touch.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have a great one.
You too.